Ochelli Effect.
And that ended the epic music for tonight, so everybody, I'm going to apologize for my voice right away up front. Oh boy. I do like the new intro, though, and yes, we are going to discuss 9/11 tonight for those of you in the chat room. I did tell you that. That's a guarantee, and get your questions ready. I'll be more than happy to take your calls in the second hour, okay? Wow. I do apologize again for my sound. It is the 21st day of March 2015. This is the Ochelli Effect, as that wonderful bumper tells you. And, of course, you're listening on ucy.tv/TOE. If not, you're on your Fondle Slab of choice using your TuneIn app, etc., whatever it is, listening to us further down the stream, as it were, on YouTube, whatever else. If you've downloaded it, you're trading it with your friends, it's all good. Thank you. And there we go. So tonight, an interesting guest who I had heard on some other shows, and now I've been told that she's kind of been on much bigger shows lately. Didn't know that when I booked her, but you know, I wanted to hear what this lady has to say, because I got a little hint of it when I was listening to my friend Randy Morgans, who does Off Planet Radio. I got a little hint of what's going on with this interesting book and her perspective on 9/11, which is something that you're not going to get from everybody out there. It's not a simple matter of plain research, but there's actually a personal perspective here, which is covered in her book, which is written in the form of a novel. But aren't a lot of the great books that tell us some truth written in the form of a novel? Anyway, Rebekah Roth, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, I think. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you sound better than me. Wonderful.
Well, sorry, I had everything hooked up here, and it for some reason it just didn't want to see my mixer and all the other electronic devices, so I'm using a standby microphone.
Well, that, you know, because you're doing my show, you never know what'll happen. It's the weirdest thing. People that have no problem going on national radio shows, doing their own radio show, try and hook up with me, and something goes very, very wrong in the code. I don't know. So,
well, it's weird. You know, after I did one show, I know that somebody lost their hard drive went out. It's really strange. Well, it's the powers. That's what we're fighting.
Well, absolutely. And of course, like I said in the preamble here, and I did bring you in a little bit late because I was having trouble getting things right. When I first tried to, no, I'll tell you right away. I mean, first of all, I'm running a fever and I sound a little strange. Like I said, I do apologize for my voice, but it is what it is, and it's live radio, so I'm willing to go on as long as I can talk. And you know, you'd probably have to kill me to get me to stop running my mouth. But I'm not going to run my mouth this entire time with you. Don't worry. and don't worry, listeners. I try to shut up when I've got a good guest, and I definitely have a good guest here. Of course, the name of the book, by the way, is The Methodical Illusion, which right away, anybody who knows me knows that that kind of a name is going to jump out at me as something of interest. Let's first talk about the meaning of the title of the book really quickly, and then I want to try to transition into how it is that you got interested in the subject and pretty much, the evolution of the novel itself. I think that would be a good place to start.
Well, I guess, I started to write a novel. I had about a 30-year flight attendant career as a purser, international purser and flight attendant at the time of 9/11. And then around 2004, I stopped flying. I just couldn't take it anymore. And at 9/11 just completely destroyed our work environment. We were treated like terrorists and gone through our lotions and our toothpaste by security and TSA. It was just too much. And so, all the time I flew, people always said to me, "Oh, you should write a novel," because I always was that person that things would happen to, and had an interesting life. And so, in my retirement, somewhere around 2008 or 9 or so, I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and write that book about that lifestyle and some of the fun stuff I did, people I met, and stuff like that. So I started to write this book, and I didn't have a title for it, and I wasn't even sure where it was going to go. And then I decided to introduce a Middle Eastern character into this novel. And so I thought, well, I'll just Google search those 19 Arab hijackers and I'll grab a first name off one and a last name off the other. And that will be my character. And so when I did that, I put in my Google search 9/11 hijackers. And lo and behold, a BBC article showed up in front of my face, dated September 23rd, 2001, that at least a half a dozen of them were still alive, and that the Saudi government, they were Saudi citizens, was suing the United States government and the FBI. And so I thought,
Right. And
well,
now that's a strange thing to begin with. And I've heard this mentioned and I've seen it mentioned and people have brought it up before. But realistically, that information is not really out there in the internet. It's just not one of those things that comes up anymore that some of these guys survived. You search for the 19 hijackers nowadays, you might get greeted with news about Zacarias Moussaoui, the alleged 20th hijacker, right?
mm-hmm.
Who I always say this, and I know it's a joke, but I remember Sesame Street when they used to play that game, which one of these things doesn't look like it belongs with the other?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Moussaoui, even if you buy the official story, this guy doesn't belong with these other guys. Not by a near shot. I mean, he's from the wrong place. He's got the wrong attitude. He's a mess. Okay, I don't even know where that guy comes from. But let's go back to the 19, right?
Well, I know where he came from. He's actually you can trace him back to. Oh, hold on a second. Something is going on. Hold on. Something is going on here. Just a second. I don't know if you can hear this,
No.
but a browser has just started up, and I'm not sure where it's coming from, to tell you the truth. So hold on a second. Let's see. And I'm going to close this. My computer has so many files open right now. I'm sorry if you heard that.
No,
it was the George Norrie show.
not a problem. It doesn't matter anyway. It could very easily be that I need to thank my listeners at the NSA for
No,
tuning.
it was me. I was trying to turn off the Facebook. I had a browser up behind all of these screens on this laptop I'm on, and apparently when I clicked on it, there was somebody had sent the George Norrie show I did the other night, and it just started playing. I tried to close the browser, but that was my technical problem because of. And when you have this many windows open on your computer, and I have lots of them.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to my story.
No problem.
Anyway, Zacarias Moussaoui,
right.
the 20th hijacker. Well, there weren't 19, so there's no way he can't be. But you'll remember there was a guy that was beheaded. I think was his name. Was it Daniel Pearl or Nick Berg? Somehow he's related to one of these murders or something. But he was actually traced down to using a CIA operative's laptop. And so I know where he's kind of coming from too, but he is kind of like all the other hijackers who are either completely made up or they're just patsies or they're Mossad agents. There's a combination, and some people actually, we used to believe that the FBI was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They would investigate something and they would come and tell us the truth about it. Well, interesting fact that I discovered after I finished writing my book. Now, I haven't stopped researching, so I'm still looking into different aspects of this and working on a sequel. So the things that I found were so fascinating, and they literally struck me so much that I thought, well, I'll get this book out, and then I'm just digging into other details. I've also been privy to a terabyte of information from the Freedom of Information Act, all of it from 9/11. And it's FAA data, it's WAV files, it's transcripts, it's interviews from the FBI. But one thing another thing, I watched this all unfold for 10 days. I luckily was home when it happened. And I didn't know any of this stuff that I found in my research. But once I found those hijackers were still alive, I actually found 10 of them are still alive. The article from the BBC was regarding, I believe, 6 of them. And one of them had actually been to the United States in flight training, and he was a professional airline pilot. And he had had his passport stolen from, just remember this city, Denver, Colorado. And so that's kind of interesting because there's, we'll relate back to Denver, Colorado a little bit later, hopefully. And so anyway, and then a lot of them had never been to the United States. The one guy that was supposed to be on the Shanksville Flight 93 crash, he didn't know what a Pennsylvania was. He had never stepped foot in the United States, nor had he ever had his passport stolen. So, and the Saudi government was angry. And, I could never find whether they settled out of court or what. But what really got my attention was the fact that the FBI was being sued by the Saudi government, and they never changed their story. They never changed their official story. Those guys are still in Wikipedia to this day as being the 19 hijackers. But while we weren't looking, in the first 72 hours, the FBI made a claim that there were 19 hijackers, but 4 of the names were different, and they were changed while we were all unfurling our flags, trying to figure out which Middle Eastern country shall we go shoot or bomb, or, just reacting because we were all just so blown away by what we saw that day. We weren't thinking straight. So of course, the Middle Eastern names are all kind of sounding alike. They're all Al something or others, and all of the hijackers were Al something or others. So what happened is they had 4 other names, and this is something I found in a book by Paul Zaremka. And the book is actually the title is something like, nobody's going to buy it, it's $180. The title is something like The History of 9/11, the Economic Results in the History of 9/11 and How It Affected our economy. Well, obviously we're running a lot of wars now because of it. So one of the things that I read and discovered is that the FBI's the original 19, of those 4, 3 of them were actually alive. One of them was an employee with the FAA. And his brother, who they claimed was the original story about Mohammed Atta's rental car, was assigned to one of these sets of brothers. And so they quickly changed that and made it be Mohammed Atta. But his brother had been dead for exactly 1 year to the date, September 11th, 2000. He died in Florida in a small plane crash. So when he calls his boss at the FAA and says, hey, you guys are saying, the FBI is saying my brother and I are hijackers. Well, I'm here to tell you I'm alive, and we weren't anywhere near the airport, and my brother's been dead for a year.
Now, does that tie in any way to the 2 brothers that they still have on the list now?
Are you talking about al-Sharihi's?
Yeah, right.
Waleed? Well, Waleed is still alive, so he's a pilot. I think it's for Air Tunisia or something. No, these are all different brothers. They had all these sets of brothers. I don't understand it, but no, these are different. These are completely 4 different names that are not part of the current set of 19, but they were the originals. And the other guys, I don't even remember what it was now they did, but they did show up alive at their local FBI and said, hey, we were here. We're still alive. Obviously, we didn't live through the crash. And so they quickly changed their name. You can actually find a correction that CNN made about about their disclosure that there was a mistake. And then later on, some of the officials in the Bush administration, head of the FBI and different organizations, they later on did admit that, well, maybe we had some cases of mistaken identity. But these people, I mean, there were lawsuits filed, and I don't know, maybe they settled out of court for an incredible amount. But that just fired me up. I'm telling you, when I found that, I thought I mean, what? And I was in cognitive dissonance. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to look at this. I knew there was something wrong from day one, just because I was a flight attendant and I knew cell phones didn't work at altitude. And also I saw heard and saw in the details that the media was laying out there, because I was glued to my TV for the first 10 days. And so I kind of got what the general public got. And watching this, I didn't know about the stolen gold and the Brady bonds and all of the evidence from the Enron lawsuit, or, whatever, I guess it was a lawsuit.
Well, let's
investigation.
Be honest. Well, let's be honest. For that first week or so, right? It wasn't unusual. There are a few people that I've heard that have said that they knew something was wrong right away. I'm not one of them. I don't state that. I always say that I was absolutely caught up in the idea that my country had been attacked, and that these people had done it, and I wasn't really concerned with their motive. I was very much caught up in the post 9/11 fervor, the desire for vengeance, so on and so forth. And I mean, I was in New Jersey at the time, and I've told this story before, that I attempted to actually get onto the island of Manhattan, which they had absolutely shut down. Okay, there was no way for me to get in, and all I did for the next, probably a month or 2 months was send supplies in to try and help people dig. Stuff like this. They didn't require guys like me anymore because they had already gotten a bunch of volunteers. And I've told this story. Now, I didn't realize that there was all of this trouble with it. I simply accepted. And I make this statement,
the majority
out of
of us
shame.
did.
Out of shame now that I accepted the story. I sat there like a good, obedient, mind-controlled idiot and continuously watched the repetitive images of these planes slamming into buildings, because at first we were treated to the second plane. Okay, because as the event was broadcast live, we saw a smoking building and then a second plane slam into the second building. Okay, it was later on that first night that CNN actually broadcast what they called, from the Gamma News organization, the first plane hitting the tower. Okay, allegedly. And then, of course, there was the whole thing with the Pentagon, which looked strange right away. There was the whole story about what had happened, in Pennsylvania. And I'm telling you now, the Pentagon and what happened in Shanksville, these two things I did not buy right away. My automatic assumption was that they had shot that plane out of the air and nobody wanted to cop to it. That was my, idea about what happened in Pennsylvania. Okay, I'm telling you my initial
that was a
impressions.
planted thought. Yeah, it was very planted. There are still people that tell me every day, that come to my website and tell me through an email that plane was shot down in Shanksville. But I can introduce them to FBI agents that were there that said there was no plane crash there.
There's no evidence of it, is what the problem is. And this has been pointed out various times, but back to the trauma-based programming, a lot of people really accepted that. And even though you knew something was wrong, for the most part, I bet you were pretty much accepting it. It was a terrifying thing. We did not really know. I mean, a lot of people forget that the idea was broadcast that this might not be the only attack, that there was going to be more. There was rumors of bombs going off at the Capitol building. The White House was under attack. Other buildings in other cities were supposedly under attack. Places that were in proximity to New York and to D.C. were shutting down left and right, for security purposes, and the rumors flew for those first 24 hours. It was as though the entire nation was vulnerable to an attack.
Well, that's what they wanted you to feel, and that is what they have planned for their next one, so that they will. I actually think I've run across their plan for the next one, and no one will feel safe, and it will create the end of what we know as America. But yeah, Lindy, anyway, I'll skip on that. We'll put that at the end, but here's what happened. And this is what I discovered by going through and looking.
Yeah. Back to your discovery, because I know we're going to revisit that before we're done. I promise you we're going to revisit that subject, because
I told you, don't let me end without going there.
Oh, don't worry. I won't. I guarantee you, because when we talked off the air, I got not too often do I hear things that I have not heard before, because I've heard a lot of this stuff from different people who have done their research one way or another, who adhere to certain groups, who are with certain people, so on and so forth, and I always find valid points in them. But you said some things to me that I have not heard before, and I want to make sure we cover that before we're done tonight. So,
Definitely. To me, that seems like the most important thing to say now. But, what I did was I methodically, one by one, tick by tick, through a very methodical dissected the phone calls and the fact what the NTSB said the planes were doing and the FAA said the planes were doing. I'm talking about descending, coming out of the sky upside down. Yeah, I mean there is documentation from our government that from the National Transportation Safety Board, and what I did was I took all the phone calls and all the times that they supposedly took place and what the aircraft were supposedly doing, and I saw there was something very wrong with the picture. And then I looked very closely at the flight attendants and what they did and what happened when I started looking into the flight attendants. Now, we had specific training as a flight attendant. Now, I'd been doing this for 30 years, so I had lots of hours of training. And we have a yearly training where we review everything that we do, our commands, how we evacuate over water or in the water, as you saw at the Hudson with that plane, that Airbus that went into the Hudson River.
well,
And
let me just introduce this in here, because I think this is going to be fascinating for the audience, is that everybody who is a staff member on a plane has to be trained, because of the incidents with the Cuban hijackers, the incidents with the Middle Eastern hijackers that have occurred many decades before 9/11. So based on those incidents and their study of those incidents, they trained you guys
exactly.
how to behave, what to do.
Exactly. We had actually the FAA hijacking protocol was called the Common Strategy, and that basically was delay the hijacker from getting into the cockpit, because once we get the pilots to land the aircraft, we could have told them we're running out of fuel, or we were dealing with the hijacker in the cabin, not the pilots, and so that we could land the aircraft where it would be liberated by a Delta Force or the SWAT team or FBI or something. And so that was the name of the game. And basically there was an entire strategy of things to do and not to do. And when I saw that two of the flight attendants actually sat on a telephone and telephone calls to their company for almost 30 minutes, they were on for 27 minutes. And then I started looking real close. Betty Ong, the very one of the flight attendants, they both called out about 20 minutes after Boston.
That's what I was going to bring up, because Betty Ong is pointed to a lot because of the very strange sort of stuff that she said during the part of the conversation that was recorded, because not the entire conversation is reportedly, been immortalized, right?
Exactly.
But the part that is there sounds really weird, and I have had it dismissed when I've said to someone, well, doesn't that sound awfully odd, the way she's talking, what she's saying, what she's doing?
Well, interesting, when I dug into her stuff, I found in FBI transcripts things that weren't really made public, and that's where I found the things that really opened my eyes, in printed FBI documents. And what I saw, she said, well, one of the first things out of her mouth, she said, he, as in one singular hijacker, he has sprayed pepper spray or mace in business class, and we can't breathe in business class. She's sitting in her jump seat at 3R, which is in the very tail. And that aircraft, just so you know, it's about 159 feet long in the cabin. So she's about 150 feet away from the action, where the hijacker is and all that. However, what I saw, and I remember this from all these crazy times I flew, if somebody sprays cheap perfume in business class, you're going to smell it in the last row coach in about 3 minutes. And I thought to myself, well, hey, how do they get the pepper spray or mace to stay only in business class? If they're in the air, they're pressurized and everyone's breathing the same air.
See, and I thought I was crazy to ask that question, because I've been in situations where pepper spray has been used, right? And you can't escape that crap. If you're in a building, even like say an office building, all right, and somebody really lets go with some pepper spray on the floor below you, your eyes are going to burn in the floor, a floor above. And an airplane is, look, again, not an expert, but an airplane is an enclosed space,
Hmm.
There's nowhere for that stuff to go except to make everybody get hit with it. I don't hear her choking.
Yep.
And this is what happens. You choke, your eyes run, and this is just being exposed to the fumes. Your eyes will start to
Hmm.
run, your throat will burn. She's showing no evidence of any of that
In a
during this.
27-minute phone call.
Right. That's impossible.
That's exactly what I saw. And
Okay.
then I went on to see she said something else that just absolutely made the hair in the back of my neck stand up. She said he, again, one singular hijacker, he went or stood upstairs. He stood upstairs. There are no stairs in a 767, which is what Flight 11 was. There are only stairs in a 747. And I knew right then and there that they were one, not pressurized, and two, on the ground, and three, inside a hangar, and they were 20 minutes from Boston.
Wow.
Okay, so she goes on and she says another thing that totally blew me away. She said, "We're the first. We're the first." Now, they were the first. They were the first of the 4 aircraft that day. But who told her that? Who told her? How would she know that? They were the first, but someone had to tell her they were the first. Someone
Well,
had to have told her what was going to happen and play out that day.
well, see, and from the audio, the way she's describing things is bizarre too, right? I mean, not. I didn't see the transcripts you saw. I would like
Mm-hmm.
to see them, but I mean, realistically, the way she's describing stuff. The number one has been stabbed. The number
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
this one has also been stabbed. We are, and
We're in
she's
the
repeating
air.
her name. We're in
Yeah,
the air.
we're in the air.
It was really completely surreal. Now, I'm not saying that I exactly know how somebody would react in that situation,
I
but
do.
that seems extremely unlikely that they would react that way and describe it that way. Now, you
Uh-huh.
know what her protocols should have been. So,
That's right.
what was it that she should have been doing?
She should have not been on a telephone because in a real hijacking, if a hijacker came back and found a flight attendant in uniform on the telephone giving away his plan, you would be killed. So number
Right.
one, neither one of them should have been on the phone. Number two, they should have told the most important detail on that phone call, if they would have made one, was how someone got into the cockpit. And actually, they never really say. She says she thinks the guys are in the cockpit, but that's what we always call the pilots. We always refer to them as the guys. And then, as women became pilots later on, then we'd have to say, oh, they're not all guys. There's a lady pilot today. But it was reference. We always would call the pilots the guys. No, the guys aren't coming, or the guys are going to the plane early, or the guys are going golfing or something. That's how we would refer to them. So the first thing that was struck me as weird is that they stayed on the phone for almost a half an hour. And two, another thing that was really weird is that she said, I don't know, but I think we might be being hijacked. And then she had to say a couple times, we're up in the air. A hijacking, that's kind of like saying you were carjacked on your bike. I mean, you're in your car when you're carjacked, right? So
Yeah.
on a hijacking, you're of course in the air, because if you weren't, and if let's say you were at the terminal on the ground somewhere, and a hijacker was, roughing up the people or the crew, you just arm your chute with the slide and open that door and get those people out. Come this way. Follow me, and they will. Those are commands we would have used, and that's what we would have done. So, of course, a hijacking only takes place in the air. And in the air was one of the things that most everybody that phoned in said to their caller, who they were calling. We're up in the air. And so I started to see things that were like scripted things that they said. And so I started taking notes and building all these charts, and I kept reverting back to these phone calls and the protocols. Now, on Flight 11, what's really interesting, we're 20 minutes away from Boston. They're on the ground in a hangar and not pressurized in 20 minutes. And that was my first marker on a map, how I found where they were brought. And then I listened to the other flight attendant on Flight 11, Amy Sweeney. She also called again to her company, to her supervisor, who she knew personally. I think they were in training together like 13 years ago. So, he just happened to have gone into management and became her supervisor. She had checked out in front of him that day. to go on her flight. And when she called in, he believes that she called from her cell phone, by the way. And he should know that because he was personal friends with her. And it probably said that in his caller ID. So she calls in, and neither one of these girls give their employee number. And anytime you as a flight attendant or pilot call the company, you are identified by two ways: your name, because there could be lots of Jane Smiths, for example, and then you would give immediately your number. I would say, hi, this is Rebekah Roth, and my number is 876-592, and I'm checking in for flight 11.
Right.
And that's how I would talk to them. Neither one of them ever said their employee number, which I also thought was weird. But Amy Sweeney made a mistake that no flight attendant would make. She called in. She's in the second to the last row in coach. And she claims that Betty Ong, who's really at her jump seat at 3R, is also sitting in that row with her in the second to the last row in coach. So we got two conflicting stories right there where they're at, okay, from these two flight attendants. And then she says the hijacker, again, one singular man, is seated in 9B. And that's a mistake you wouldn't make. Later on, she calls her supervisor back because she called out back to him 3 or 4 times. She lost her connection, supposedly. And she called and she said, oh, no, I made a mistake. The hijacker is actually in 10B. That mistake she made is not something you would ever make. And the reason why is, like I told you from the beginning, the first thing we would do is prevent them from getting into the cockpit so the pilots could land the aircraft at the first available place. So once they find out by using a code word, and one of them was methodical, that we would call them and say, we're being a hijacker on board, and we'd use these code words. And they would then squawk the 7500 hijack code in the cockpit to the frequency, the air traffic control, and everybody would know that we have a hijacker on board, and the pilots would be landing the aircraft somewhere and be talking to the ground about where they're at, where they're going, and we would start coordinating getting the passengers safe. And so that making a mistake by saying that you're a hijacker when you're not, that would be a surefire bullet in your head. So we wouldn't make that mistake unless she knew for some reason that 9B was the hijacker. So, I thought, well, that's really weird that she did that. And then I started to look a little bit into this passenger in 9B. And now this is really interesting. He was a trained assassin from a foreign intelligence agency. He was also an anti-hijacking specialist, and he was also highly trained in hostage rescue. Now, hostage rescue is when you've got a hijacked aircraft on the ground. That's hostage rescue specialists. And I'm thinking, well, now, what are the chances that this guy would be killed? He's and his friends, I kind of read a little bit about him because there's lots of stuff on Wikipedia about passenger 9B on flight 11 will get you all kinds of reading material on this guy. He was a trained assassin from an Israeli Defense Forces called the Sayeret Matkal. And they're kind of like, I don't even know, I call him the Israeli Jack Bauer. His friend said he could kill any human being using a pen and a credit card. And yet, interestingly enough, he grew up in Denver, Colorado. Remember, one of the passports was stolen from Denver, Colorado. And he was back visiting the United States. He lived in Denver, Colorado until he was 14. Then he moved to Israel, and at 18 he joined the Israeli Defense Forces, which is mandatory. And then they put him in, because he's highly intelligent, they put him in the Sayeret Matkal Special Forces. These are the trained assassins. And just so you know, you can look that up too. Let me spell that for your listeners, because it's really an interesting read. I had no idea. Now, I studied terrorists and hijackers and all that stuff for my whole career. And a Sayeret Matkal is Sayeret Matkal. I believe that's how you spell it. And what's very interesting is Ehud Barak, who was a prime minister of Israel, he was in New York City the night before 9/11 on the 10th, and on the morning of September 11th, he was sitting in the BBC studios. He's the man who coined the phrase war on terror, and one of the first people to tell us it was Osama bin Laden behind this attack. And also Bibi Netanyahu is a Sayeret Matkal Special Forces. I find that just kind of fascinating. I just, what are the chances? It's kind of an elite force, and what are the chances that we in America would have one of Israel's finest anti-hijacking specialist and assassin on that flight, and we are led to believe that he was killed by a plastic box cutter. Now, he's fluent in English, he's fluent in Hebrew, and he is fluent in Arabic. So when Amy Sweeney calls back and she fixes her error, she says, oh, no, the hijackers are seated in 10A and B. And so now, revert back to the last time you flew. All your listeners, get yourself strapped in, put your seatbelts on, and stow your tray table for just a second. And if you've been believing the official story that this guy was the first person killed, I want you to just take your hand and slap your face, because this is your wake-up call. We had a highly trained assassin who was fluent in Arabic, listening to the people sitting 18 inches from his ear, planning the new Pearl Harbor, the attack of the century, 9/11, and a hijacking. And he did nothing to stop it, nor could he. They just decided to jump up, and on their way to the cockpit, they reached over and chopped his head off with a box cutter. Now, sometime tomorrow, go to a Lowe's hardware store and go buy yourself one of those box cutters. You can Google search one of those because they claim they found one in the ditch on Flight 93.
Right.
It's the yellow plastic one that's a half an inch wide, about 5 inches long, and it's got a little serrated edge. It's kind of more like an X-Acto knife, and it would be impossible really to hurt anyone with one, but we are led to believe that's their official story. He is a hero, by the way, in Israel. 9B, passenger 9B on Flight 11. So I found that, and when I read that, I had to go over it again and again and again, and I thought, no, I can't even believe this. And it's not something that I remember hearing about. But that's the official story. If you read the story or read everything, if you just read about this on Wikipedia, you're going to find out that this guy was just incredible. And like I said, he's a businessman traveling. His friends all said he could kill any human being on the planet with a pen and a credit card, but he chose to just be killed by a box cutter that day. If you believe that, you need to just jump off the cliff right now. You need to slap yourself silly, because that's craziness right there.
Well,
okay, so...
Yeah, that's wholly unbelievable, too, because just the nature of the damn box cutter, I'm sorry, but I used to have to use these things at work, okay? All they were good for, really, was cutting up, like packing tape. That was about what they were good for.
Yeah, plastic and that, exactly. That's about it.
They snap if you push them out a little too much. They're meant to actually snap so you can go get yourself another sharp piece again. Okay? That's exactly what they're designed to do. They're disposable. I mean, usually I'd break them before I was finished with them anyway. And meanwhile, these guys who, had never really, not elite forces guys or whatever, they could take down. First of all, I found it bizarre that, other people didn't try and take these guys down with just a box cutter anyway. Like the whole let's roll scenario, and of course everybody got behind that because that was meant to, give the Americans the illusion that we had fought back against them,
that was an illusion too. And I'll tell you more about that whole thing.
Oh yeah, definitely. And we've kind of gotten a little off track for your discovery here. Of course, we've gotten deep into the rabbit hole, as it were, right away.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what's interesting about that passenger 9B is he is the only person in all of the FBI documents I've read that they go into details, including the color of his wife's hair, where she grew up, and the fact that his mother's a doctor in Jerusalem. I mean, it's just crazy. I read that and I thought, well, who wrote this? The president of his fan club? Because it has details that have nothing to do with 9/11, but it's all about him. You'll read this in an FBI document, what kind of car he drove, how much money he was worth, what his mother does. I mean, it's really bizarre. As I started reading that, I thought, this is just really nuts that they claim he's dead, but my goodness, they just glorify him into godhood. And so...
That's my experience with the FBI anyway. I mean, when you and I were talking off the air, you had mentioned Jack Rubenstein, who's Jack Ruby, who I happen to know a little bit about. Of course, if you go through the Warren Commission volumes, you can find out everything about Jack Ruby, okay, including the condition of his mother's teeth in, like, 1935. I'm not kidding you. There is literally an exhibit in the Warren Commission, the exhibits section of the Warren Commission, explaining the condition of Jack Ruby's mother's teeth. I'm not kidding you. Okay, so when the FBI has control of somebody, just so you know, it's not as though they don't know who they have control of. Okay.
Oh, Oh, definitely. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that I found because later on I'm in the FBI documents, I found 2 women involved, not just 19 Arab hijackers. I found they weren't involved, and actually 10 of them are still alive. And people that are much more into intelligence. I mean, I'm just a flight attendant retired, but I've read stuff from people, Paul Zaremka's information and stuff from intelligence agencies that talk about using doubles and also making up these fake names, just exactly what I was going to do for my novel. Make a, first name from one person, a last name from another, completely fake people. Just
Well, yeah,
completely fake.
it's a literary mechanism that a lot of writers use, where they scramble the name of a real character, or
Mm-hmm.
they reverse their names if they seem to have a first and a last name that are interchangeable. They'll actually reverse them so
Mm-hmm.
that you get sort of a whiff of who it is we're really talking about here
Mm-hmm.
without directly naming them.
Mm-hmm.
Like you might. Oh, I don't know. Let's just say you have
I did that all through my book, and you can recognize all the players.
Oh, see, that's why I brought it up
Uh-huh.
because, of
Yep.
course, you were talking to me about this. That was what
Uh-huh.
you did all throughout. I love the one name of the guy, the 9/11 truther guy, but we'll get into him later.
Oh, yeah. And so anyway, what happened is I started systematically, methodically going through these calls and the details and the things that I found in these FBI documents that people said and did and what the planes were supposed to be doing. And it just could not fit. The puzzle would not go together. And so when I put all this together, we had these 2 flight attendants on Flight 11. One says they're seated in the same row together. One says she's in her jump seat. Well, those 2 different locations. And then one of them says that the hijacker was the hijacker in 9B. And then she says, no, it was 10B. And then the hijacker that she first reported 9B was actually stabbed. And she said a doctor and a nurse were taking care of him. The other flight attendant, who's supposed to be sitting there right there with her, reports that there is no medical doctor or nurse or any medical personnel on board. They paged, couldn't find anybody. And I'm thinking, okay, well, you're rallied, especially in a hijacking, you got to have your stories together. It's got to be the same thing because we're talking to, we would be normally, if you were to let any information out, if you could go into the bathroom and use your cell phone or somehow sneak an airphone in your hand and not let anybody see you were on the phone,
One,
get some information out, you would want to make that information be important, not where you're working. She kept saying, Betty Young kept saying, I'm at 3R. That's just her work position.
well, weird, right? And you know what? It's funny because a question just came in because I will
Mm-hmm.
take the Skype text questions. By the way, I'd rather you guys call in the second hour, but the thing is, this question is relevant right now. Give an idea as to, because you said that the one flight attendant is describing Betty Ong as sitting next to her. Betty Ong is describing herself as being, in a completely different location in the plane. How big of a difference are we talking about here, as far as where she said she is and where the other flight attendant is saying Ong is?
Well, Betty Ong 3R is the very aft jump seat. It's the most farthest one away from the cockpit. And she would be on the right side of the aircraft. And I don't know what passenger seat, the second to the last row. And, there could be a bulkhead in between them. There could be, it's a double aisle aircraft. So she could have been sitting on the left aisle, or she could have been sitting in the center, but she could have been, she was at least 6 to 20 feet away from Betty.
So
Betty was in her jump seat and she was in the second to the last row.
Right, so this isn't like a minor thing. I mean, otherwise, if you listen to the to Amy's description, she's right next to her,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of that's not like it's only a few seats away or something. No, this is a huge difference. Plus, there'd be some sort of obstruction between where she is and where Ong is supposed to be, right?
Quite possibly. The thing is that they're both, I mean, if you're in your jump seat, there's only one person that can sit there. And if they were, happen to be on a double jump seat, like on a 747, they would have both reported they're at that jump seat. But one said that Betty Ong is sitting next to her in the second to the last row, and Betty Ong saying she's in her jump seat. Well, that led me to believe. Now, I kept going back methodically to what I had so far, they were no longer pressurized because in a half an hour phone call, neither one of them complained about the effects of pepper spray or mace. Neither one of them coughed ever. Neither one of them had a hard time seeing ever or said, oh, this gas or mace or pepper spray, it's just starting to get to me in a half an hour. And trust me, it would be in the whole aircraft within 2 to 3 minutes. And so since they didn't do that, and then when she said he stood upstairs, I realized they were in a hangar. They were off the aircraft, and they were more than likely upstairs in a office building or in offices, and probably in 2 different offices. So they didn't know what each other were saying. They were told what to say, but they didn't know. That's why their stories didn't jive. That's why one said there was a doctor on board. She wasn't on board anymore. She didn't know. And the passenger in 9B wasn't really stabbed. He was standing there with her with a gun. And they did report initially a gun on a couple of the flights, including Flight 11, but then the FBI tried to cover that up because there was an Israeli company also that ran security at those 3 airports, Boston, Dulles, and Newark. Just coincidentally, it's just another coincidence, but we had security was at that time before the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security. The airline could choose a private security company, and one of those was ICTS from Israel, and that is who was running the security there.
Right.
So just coincidentally, but if they got caught letting a gun get through, they would have lost their contract. And so the FBI quickly changed that, that there wasn't really a gun on board. So there was all these weird things that, that they couldn't really change some of the details because these were notes they took, and these are some of the stuff is recorded on the recording. So what I found was just really fascinating, that the differences and the changes, including the times of the phone calls, they either happened at 8:18, 19, or 20, and they started. Another thing I discovered is that on each of the flights, at the exact same minute, 2 people called out. 2 people called out of that exactly the same minute. They both called at, it depends on who you believe, but at 8:18, at 8:19, or 8:20, and maybe within 30 seconds of each other.
Well,
and that goes for every flight.
Well, that's bizarre, but also the idea that that there were cell phones in use, and then there were these, the seatback phones, and I hear people go back to that a lot. That that the cell phone communication wasn't even a possibility. I mean, they might have gotten some sort of sporadic contact here and there, but cell phone technology being what it was in 2001. It wasn't really likely that they were going to get through that way. So then I've heard people say, well, no, it's actually the seatback phones.
Well, yeah, and that's a problem because American Airlines didn't have any operating seatback phones, and that Flight 77 that supposedly went into the Pentagon, that Barbara Olson supposedly called in from an airphone, they had deactivated all of their airphones on their 757s by January 31st, 2001, an impossibility. And so you see, and also just so you know that in the Zachariah Moussaoui trial, the 20th hijacker, supposedly, they didn't even talk about Betty or Barbara Olson, not even mention her phone calls. Period. Zip, nada. Just like Building 7 in the official 9/11 hearings, not a word about Building 7 falling down. A 47-story building fell down that day at 5:20, and nobody mentioned it in the entire official story of 9/11.
Right, which, I absolutely point to that as a big problem, especially being what was housed in that building. Okay, there's no reason for it to have collapsed. There's no reason for the other 2 to have collapsed. Okay, based on what we're told happened. But
very true.
There's even less of a reason for Building 7 to have collapsed, because their claim is that falling debris and all that weakened the structure. That's like, come on. How many times do we have to go over this? Building 7 is an impossibility if the conditions exist, if there's something else going on.
Well, I actually was still sitting at my, I was glued to my television. One, we had never been warned about a hijacker or possibility of hijacking by anybody named Osama bin Laden, or had never ever been told in our hijack training segment of our yearly training of Al-Qaeda. And so I was just totally blown away. I'm like, how could this guy get control of NORAD I just couldn't believe what I'd seen. Well, I'm sitting at my TV and watched Building 7 come down, and I was like, well, that's a controlled demolition. How
See,
did they do that so quickly?
and I've had a pilot or two tell me that that they would have been well prepared. Everybody who was in the air that day, commercially, they would have been well prepared to send particular signals without using the radios. Okay, that there is a system that, you got to excuse me here. I don't know the exact terms for this, but it was explained to me in real basic kind of terms that there is a system by which a communication happens where they give them a particular set of numbers that tells them that they're being hijacked, that tells them that the plane is in trouble, and all of that without them using the radios. Okay, that has to be there. They have to know what codes to enter. They also issue warnings to all the staff of airlines. At least they did at that point in time, right?
We had never been warned about a possibility of hijacking by Al-Qaeda, or a terrorist group or hijacking group, or possibility by Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda ever. Prior to 9/11, that was the very first time I'd ever heard of Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. And you're talking about the hijack code. It's called 7500. It's a radio frequency, and it's very, very easy to do. And what would happen in a normal hijacking, I would pick up an interphone inside the cabin of the aircraft, and I would say, Captain Ochelli, this is Rebekah Roth. I'm being methodical. This is a horrible trip. Those words would tell him I have a hijacker that wants in the cabin. They don't use those words anymore, so I can share them. But using code words like that would allow them to then hit that it's just a little dial, and squawk 7500. That hijack code then would go out to the air traffic controllers and other aircraft and the company, who would say there's a hijacker in the airplane. Not in the cockpit, in the airplane. And our job, remember, was delay, delay, delay. So the most important thing those girls could have said was, how did they get in? Did they, did they have a cockpit key with them? Did they kick the door in? Did they, have some sort of explosive device in the lock? How did they get in? That would have been the important thing, because that's what we would have wanted to prevent forever and ever after this, right? Had there really been hijackers on board. But what I did find out was there weren't Arab hijackers on board. In fact, there were handlers on board. There were people that were professional handlers in situations like this, much like 9B was a hostage rescue anti-hijacking person and a trained assassin. That type of person with special training to handle situations where we're dealing with a group of passengers. And these people were part of this, and I think what they had to have done, well, first off, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. When I realized Betty Ong said, I don't know, but we might be being hijacked, that she didn't know she was being hijacked. That meant there wasn't a hijacker on board with some sort of weapon making hijacker demands. She was confused. She said, I don't know. And let me tell you this, when there's a hijacker on board and he's making demands, you know it. There's no I don't knows. We are under it's like CPR in progress. It's not maybe we're doing this or not. You are doing it.
Let me ask you this question, because this is something that you would know. If, for instance, though, the pepper spray had happened, right, and that had happened on the aircraft, and meanwhile this flight attendant is not aware of what's going on, but she knows that something has happened. Okay, that there's definitely a disruption on the airplane. Wouldn't there have been a procedure where she explained that without ever using the word hijacking? Like, we have a disturbance, or we have some, there's some other code that tells them that they have an unstable person that's acting out on the plane or something. I mean, doesn't that happen as well?
We don't call the ground if there's something going on. The pilots do that. We don't make phone calls from the airplane. It's impossible.
Right. No, I understand that.
So,
what I'm saying is, if she was to make a communication, she would have first made it to the pilot, right? Mm-hmm. But secondly, there would have been a different kind of language if, say, she didn't really know what was going on. If she wasn't aware and she just knew that they had a disturbance, she would have let the captain know, or let the guys in the cockpit know that they had a problem back there, and that would have been a totally different language, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you have a disgruntled passenger or somebody that you need to constrain, you would tell them we've got an incident. We're going to have to land. What depends on. I mean, I had CPR in progress where I was in the middle of doing CPR and basically just told one of the other flight attendants because I couldn't stop. I said, just go tell the captain I have CPR in progress and we got to land this aircraft now. And we were loaded up with fuel heavy going coast to coast, and we landed in a Midwest city, gross over maximum weight 747 because we didn't have time to dump fuel. And so that's how you would communicate. She picked up the phone and said, Captain, we have CPR in progress. We need to land. The captain then just looked at his map and said, okay, I think we went into Detroit, Michigan, and told the passengers, prepare the cabin we are going in for an emergency landing. We have CPR in progress. And so that's the kind of stuff you do. There's no code words for anything except a hijacking, but that's what was supposedly going on that day.
Right.
It's just that everything else is pretty straightforward, and yes, you would communicate that to the pilot. Yeah.
But I mean, did you ever have an instance where you had a disturbance on the plane, just somebody freaked out for some reason, a fist fight broke out, some other nonsense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, it's bound to happen, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But there's no code word for it. You just say, we got a fight on board.
Okay.
And I mean, there's also we had at that time also we have plastic handcuffs, and so there are ways that we constrain people.
Right.
Restrain them, I guess is the better word. So anyway, what I found was there was this weird confusion about whether it was one hijacker or three hijackers. The official story said there was 4 or 5, and the flight attendants were only saying one. So I went in there, and with that fact that none of the pilots, all military trained, ever squawked 7500, the hijack code from the cockpit, I realized they didn't know they were being hijacked ever. And also, so there is a weapon inside each cockpit, and so neither one of them used that we're supposed to believe that somehow these 5'6" hijackers got in. They were all 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", small guys. That they got in and took control over these macho pilots, all military trained pilots, that all 4 aircraft, all 8 pilots were military trained, and somehow they decided not to fight back and not to use the weapon that they have right there handy, and it's a big one. That this whole thing happened. So what I started to see was the scenario. There was something wrong. There was just things were not right. The pilots weren't doing hijack. The girls flight attendants weren't doing hijack protocol. And of Flight 11, there were nearly 100 people, between 11 crew members, and I think there was nearly 80 or 82 or some around 80 passengers. That's a lot of people. Why didn't anyone else pick up their airphone or cell phone? And a half an hour that these girls were talking on the phone. Well, then I realized here, they needed those phone calls, and they needed all the details, and the details that came out were scripted. And they said things like this: of Middle Eastern descent. And I'm telling you, in 30 years, I would never have described a passenger that way, or a neighbor. I'd say, I would not say that. I would say maybe he has olive skin, dark hair, curly hair, balding, light colored skin, African American, but I would never say Middle Eastern descent, because it's impossible to tell somebody from Morocco, from Greece, or from Turkey. I mean, you just can't. It's just impossible. And so I found that, but they were all using the same terminology, which was the hijackers are of Middle Eastern descent. And that's just not the way we speak as Americans. I mean, it's not something we would say. And so again, another flag came up. And so I realized that what probably happened is the aircraft was taken over by what's called the flight termination system. It overrides the autopilot. It operates on the same frequency that the transponder of the aircraft operates on. And once the flight termination system takes over the aircraft, and let me tell you real quickly how these were sold to some commercial carriers in the United States in the 90s, in the early to mid 90s. In the event of a hijacking and a hijacker were to get inside the cockpit, we can take control of the aircraft and land it remotely. Why? I bet you're asking. In this situation on 9/11, when we had 4 aircraft that the cockpit had been commandeered, why did they not use the flight termination system?
Right.
Good question, because it was already in use by them, the perpetrators, that had handlers on board each aircraft.
Well,
Now, there were
that is a bizarre thing, and I'll tell you that the question becomes more valid when you say to yourself, okay, let's just say, theoretically, that they had done this, they had pulled this off, they'd commandeered the four aircraft. All right, let's just say you get that first incident hitting the tower. Okay, they don't know necessarily what's going on. Let's just say that in the confusion they couldn't figure it out. They weren't quite aware that there was a hijacking in progress. By the time that second plane hits, how is it that they didn't take over the aircraft? I've always wondered that. Because
Well, I'll tell you why. Because the aircraft were all on the ground no later than 9:15 to 9:20 that day at the same location. All of those aircraft were brought to that location that is within 20 minutes from Boston Logan. And how I figured that out was the time that the phone calls were made and the flight time from Dulles and Newark to that place. Now, how did I find that place? I knew that they had to be well within 20 minutes from Boston Logan, and that those aircraft were considered heavy jets because they were loaded with fuel, and they would need at least a 10,000-foot runway that was not manned. They would also need large hangars, and I found a military base that was a reserve base only at the time of 9/11 with an 11,595-foot runway. Later on, after I wrote the book, as I figured out where they were all brought to remotely using the flight termination system. Once the flight termination system takes over, by the way, the pilots can no longer communicate with the flight attendants in the cabin or anyone on the ground through any way. That's why the pilots didn't want the flight termination system to be put. The Airline Pilots Association was very much against this device. It was sold as an anti-hijacking device. In the event that the hijackers got into the cabin, the planes could be remotely landed. However, the drawback was that the pilots lost all communication. And remember when we first started talking, I told you once we delay, and the pilots land the aircraft somewhere, the SWAT team or the FBI or somebody's got to come in and commandeer the aircraft and get the people safe, right? And kill the hijackers or whatever they do. And so that takes some coordination, and the pilots didn't want to lose that ability to talk on the radio to say, okay, we've got, the hijacker's got such and such a weapon, or he's making such and such a demand. They would have lost all of that type of communication. So when we know that the Delta Force is going to crash through the door, some flight attendant's going to have to disarm or shoot and open the door, or they're going to get a shoot at them, right? Because that's how you get into the aircraft. Right. How are they going to get in? They're going to come through the cockpit window, because there's some airplanes that have cockpit windows that open or have a hatch up in the cockpit. And they couldn't have communicated any of that with the liberating force, whatever it was. And so they lost.
The question in the chat room right now is Stewart Airport, where the planes crossed, was the question.
Okay, well, let me get to that, because I went there too, and I actually went to Cleveland like everyone else. But let me tell you this, in that Freedom of Information Act terabyte of data that I have, right, it's radar in text. And where they would like you to believe those airplanes flew to, they did not. They landed way before they got to Stewart. Stewart International that day was used to land many commercial planes, but not these four. These four went into a reserve military base, and after I did a real large audience blog talk radio show, and if I can say who that was, it really doesn't matter, but I got a phone call from someone, and this will make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I never say the name of this because I really want people to read the book so they can get all of the information that's in there. And it's a good page turner. It's kind of a fun little vacation. Everybody wants to see it made into a movie, and there's lots of interest in that as well. So that's kind of fun. But she called me, got a hold of me through my website, and she told me exactly what base it was, because she was in the reserves base there, activated on the morning of 9/11. The base had been evacuated of all personnel, and every one of the 2,000 people in her unit were locked out of the base for 2 to 3 days. And she said, until I heard your interview, now I know why. I know what was on that base. That base also has 6 large hangars. It's a C5 transport base, and so you know that a C5 transport is actually larger than a 747. That's the one you see on the TheraFlu commercial that's on television right now, where it opens up, the whole nose opens up, and they can run tanks and stuff inside there.
Right.
That one. That's a C5, and this is a C5 base, a
Mm.
reserve unit base.
So more than adequate to handle the the heavyweight
Oh, yeah.
757, no problem.
Oh yeah, the runway's big enough to handle the biggest airplane flying, the C5. 11,595 feet, plenty of runway, and they have these gigantic hangars as well, and all hangars have stairs and have offices up above. And so when I put all the pieces of this puzzle together, it made me understand that the pilots, they didn't know they were being hijacked because they were being taken over remotely, and all they knew was the aircraft was landing. And when the flight attendant Betty on called, she did say, "We can't call the cockpit." Well, let me tell you a little secret. For the first 18 minutes, there's no reason a flight attendant in coach working the aft galley, as she was, would call the cockpit for any reason unless they started a descent, which they had. In order to land and get that plane on the ground, before she made that phone call, then she could have said, "We can't call the cockpit." There would be no reason for her to call the cockpit. What she would have been doing, her in-flight duties, was making coffee, making orange juice, pulling out the meal carts once the aircraft reaches a cruising altitude. And it takes almost 15 to 20 minutes to do that.
Mm.
And especially on a flight that long, you're not going to pull those carts out. They weigh about 400 pounds. Depending upon, what kind of cart they are. If it's a beverage cart, they're between 200 and 400 pounds. So you don't pull those out unless the aircraft is leveled off. And that just takes a while when you're loaded up with fuel, 100 passengers. It'd take you probably about 18 minutes or maybe a little bit longer. And a lot of that depends on the traffic as you're leaving Boston. If there's, traffic that's holding you down a little bit lower. And once you get up to cruise altitude, you pull your carts out, and then, she'd have been cooking the breakfast. And we serve food right away on those long flights, especially early morning departures, because people get up early and oftentimes don't get a chance to eat. So we try to, give them coffee and juice and food right away. But if the aircraft were starting a descent, she would want to know, because if she had carts that were unlocked, then she would want to lock them up for landing. And also, she would have thought that since they were supposed to be flying a 6-hour flight and they're not reaching cruise altitude, and they are just maybe starting a descent, it's just things aren't normal, she would call the cockpit to find out, is there an emergency? How should I prepare the cabin and the passengers? And she couldn't contact them. That was another thing that told me the flight termination system took over. And let me quickly tell you about the flight termination system. This is a really interesting connection. You'll remember that there is the comptroller of the Pentagon, Rabbi Dov Zakheim was his name. He was under investigation, or the Pentagon was, and he was the comptroller. He ran the money for misplacing $2.3 trillion.
Right.
And there was an investigation. Donald Rumsfeld told us all about it September 10th, the day before this incident. Well, he also has a company that makes the flight termination system. He sold it to Boeing. It's called SPC, Sam Paul Charlie, SPC Corporation. I don't know if that's what it stands for, but it's SPC, so you know what. You can look up and you can Google search this. He was the CEO of the SPC Corporation at the time they made the flight termination. By the way, the flight termination system is how we operate our drones, I believe, to this very day. They also make control units that can control drone aircraft or commandeered remotely controlled aircraft like we had on 9/11, and 8 of them out of one location. And that can be put in a truck, small truck, not a pickup, but like a box truck, like a delivery truck.
Before we're through the first hour, by the way, by a bit, and we're into the second hour, which we only got 2. So a couple of things I just want to get to, and then I want to get back into the book again, and then hopefully we'll have time to take some calls. The thing is this: if we assume that you're absolutely correct, all right, that this is precisely where all 4 of these aircraft went, okay. First of all, what happened to the passengers? And second of all, what actually hit the buildings?
Well, that's 2 really good questions. Now, since my book came out, I've been contacted by lots of people from American Airlines, and they were friends with the crew members, pilots and flight attendants alike. putting our heads together, this is how we think the scenario was played out. If you'll recall, and I'm sure if your listeners have any knowledge about 9/11, there were more than a dozen military war games being played that day. And throughout the country, all across the country, there were military war games going on that day.
Right.
And so we believe that when the handlers, the hijackers were really handlers on board, when the aircraft was landed remotely, that they told the pilots and the flight attendants that you're part of a drill. And we're going to take you two women, Betty Ong and Amy Sweeney, off the airplane. And they did. And then they told us, as the Illuminati always does, what they used to kill those people. The mace or pepper spray was more than likely something more like cyanide, hydrogen cyanide. A lethal gas was thrown in. The aircraft had sealed up, and they would probably all be taken down within a minute to 3 minutes. The two flight attendants that were on the phone, and that explains why no one else made a phone call. And none of the pilots ever made a phone call. Only flight attendants and passengers. So that's what we're coming up with. That's our best deduction. Of course, we're not going to show paperwork because nobody's going to have this documented. But the only way that a flight attendant and a pilot would have something like this go on without fighting whoever they were that commandeered those aircraft was to believe they were part of a drill for the United States government, for the military, for FAA, for NORAD. We're testing the system. And so we're pretending to be a hijacker. And then what I saw as I took over, methodically went through each flight and the phone calls that were said. On Flight 175, the next flight out of Boston, we had a passenger say that he thought the hijackers, this is less than 15 minutes after the first plane supposedly hit the North Tower. He has no way of knowing what had happened because we didn't know until after the second plane hit. Remember, us people watching TV, he's up in an airplane. He didn't have a clue. He said he thinks the hijackers are going to fly the plane to Chicago and fly it into a building. And then another guy called in and he said, 8 minutes after the hijacking supposedly took place, he said they were over Ohio 3 minutes before impact in Manhattan. And now you're from there, so if you've flown into Newark, LaGuardia, or JFK, 3 minutes before impact into the South Tower, and you look out the window and you're a pilot, you know damn good and well you are not in Ohio. You know you're over Manhattan. You know it if you're a flight attendant that's ever flown in there one time, because of your first trip, let me tell you this, your first trip into New York as a flight attendant, you are hanging out the window looking. I mean, you're like, whoa, because New York is only New York.
Well, even as a passenger, you're looking out. You're catching a look at the Statue of Liberty.
And then here's the giveaway. Here's the giveaway. This passenger, he's an F-14 fighter pilot, retired. Now he's working as I could only find he was a business consultant until I'll tell you where he really worked. He says to his mommy, he calls his mom 3 minutes before impact of the South Tower. She says not only are they over Ohio, which everyone wanted you to go to, but he said, we're thinking a bunch of passengers are thinking about taking over the cockpit, taken away from the hijackers. That's the scenario. Let's roll Flight 93. And someone, either he knew this because he was a planner, or someone told him that one of the planes, they were going to have a hero group. I think he was a planner, because guess who he works for? MITRE Company. Guess who was in the FAA headquarters for 2 years leading up to this, that were dealing with radar technology in the FAA headquarters? P-TECH and MITRE Company. MITRE is the shadow government. And let me spell that out for your audience. It's MITRE, and you can look that up. They are involved in everything. This is the shadow government that runs this country, and it's on everything from now your healthcare, Obamacare, to the IRS and everything in between.
Right, they're actually one of these wonderful shell companies that seems to be just having its tentacles in everything.
Everything.
And that's the truth. I mean, there's no denying that.
So let me tell you quickly.
This is who this guy winds up working for, huh?
Yeah, and I found that
Nice.
out reading his obituaries after the book came out, because I'm still looking at all the handlers and who they probably were. So let me tell you a little bit more about Dov Zakheim, because he's really instrumental in this whole event. He was the comptroller of the Pentagon that they were investigating this misplaced 2.3 trillion. He is the CEO of SPC that made the flight termination system. He also, the SPC has a subsidiary company called Tridata. Tridata got a contract to repair the World Trade Center towers after the 93 bombing. This is one of the only companies, and architects or engineers for 9/11 Truth can't even get the blueprints for the towers, and they've been gone 14 years, that had the blueprints for both the North and the South Tower. Now, he had one other job. He has one other group. It's a consortium he's involved with. What they do is they transform commercial 767s into military refueling tankers and sell them to militaries around the world. Now, how involved do you think he was? He also went to work for Booz Allen Hamilton after he left the Pentagon. We never did look for that money after 9/11. You know that. Never found it. Just he misplaced a bunch more. I've heard up to the tune of possibly $9 trillion. He was been misplaced from there. So what I found is we have the flight termination system. We have the crew members thinking they're in a drill, and I believe the only way they could do this. Keep in mind that the flights from Boston came into this area within 15 minutes of each other. So they had, 150 to 180 people to get rid of right away quickly. And they only pulled 2 people off each aircraft to make the calls until they got to Flight 93. And let me tell you this, those phone calls from Flight 93, if you look at them, every single one of them was for one purpose: to get you, America, involved emotionally and to pull your heartstrings, and to again tell you it was of Middle Eastern descent people that were doing this to you and your country. You were being programmed by a Middle Eastern country that is not Arab, not Muslim either. But they had some of it right. I mean, they were from a Middle Eastern country, a rather small one, that's very involved in the United States government.
Yeah, well, which one would that be?
Let me see. So anyway, these are the things that I found, and unfortunately, when I found it, it truly made me physically ill, because I almost was on one of those planes, and so the reality of this was so. It just like someone kicked me in the gut. I mean, I just couldn't write. I was like catatonic for a month. And I went back then, I thought, I'm going to debunk myself. This cannot be true. And I over and over, and I teach the reader, by the way, in the book, The Methodical Illusion, I teach you how I did this, how I found it out. And I actually take the reader through that moment when myself and my husband, which are basically 2 characters in the book, Vera Hansen and Jim Bowman, who's a retired pilot, discover when those phone calls were made. They had to have been on the ground, and the flight time between those 3 airports, and they discover what I did, where they were taken to, how it was covered up. The radar technology is such that you can load anything into a computer, and they could have even done it prior to the day. That wasn't even where the airplanes really went. The moment that the flight termination took over, they lost them on radar, every one of them.
Well, and that's another thing, because now I'm being asked, because I did ask the question before. I mean, what do you think actually hit the targets?
That's really a great question. I'm good friends with Barbara Honegger, and I have a friend who was actually inside the Pentagon. So I know for a fact that there was no plane crash there. I remember hearing Joey McIntosh say, no, there's no plane crash here. And I saw there was no plane parts there. And part of my training was studying crashes, so I'm pretty familiar with what you would have seen had a plane really crashed into that wall. That wall, by the way, had just been reinforced with steel and Kevlar. So it may be one thing to go through a brick building, and that you wouldn't even go through. The nose cone of the aircraft is made out of composite plastic because there's a radar in there. And so you'll see, if you'll remember looking at the Lockerbie, Scotland deal, that 747, the nose, and you'll see that the Delta one that just went into LaGuardia, they took the nose cone right off that rounded part that you see that. kind of where they put that cute smiley on some of the planes. That's all composite plastic is underneath there, and that's right in front of the cockpit. So that stuff, it's crazy. I have lots of pilots that come to me and ask me this question, and I don't have an answer for it. How did they get a 767 to fly into that South Tower? How did they do that? I thought it was trick photography, because in my flight attendant mind, and having studied crashes for 30 years, airplanes cannot fly in through a building and disappear like that. They just can't. They are aluminum. I've seen hail in the Midwest take aircraft out and make huge holes in the aluminum, the wings or the fuselage, and bird strikes, the same thing. I mean, their birds are hardly anything themselves. They're kind of like little airplanes.
Right.
They're not real strong. Hail, that's ice. It's a little bit different, but I mean, it doesn't take much. You can look and see what that Delta plane did. It hit a wrought iron fence, and it just tore one of the wings completely off. And they weren't going 50 miles an hour on that runway sliding on the ice the other day.
Well, that's a bizarre thing here too, because the plane slamming into the tower appears to cut through it. I mean, like butter.
Hot knife through butter.
No problem. Okay, now look, if I take a moment and I accept that that's a possibility with that type of an aircraft, if I decide to do that, which I'm not that brain damaged yet, but I'm going to accept it for the sake of this discussion. Now, how is it that a plane disappears into a little hole at the Pentagon? Either you have something that is substantial enough to do damage to cement reinforced by steel, okay? The engines, for instance, are not necessarily made of this very lightweight material. There's a lot more to them.
No, they're titanium. They don't disappear.
Right. They don't disappear. They're going to do some damage if they slam into something. I don't see any evidence of that at the original photographic evidence of the Pentagon. There's no evidence of the engines hitting the building.
Not only that, but the engines on a 757 are about 40 feet apart. So if their official story would have come true, and what you would see is the engines continuing, because that's the driving force of the aircraft, and they are made of lots of serious metal like titanium it's not bendable. It's not like the aluminum frame of the aircraft. They would have been two 40-foot holes, and they're about 9 feet in diameter. 8 to 9 feet somewhere in there. They're pretty good size. And you would have seen two holes, not just one hole where, they think that went in. But getting back to the Pentagon, the research, the investigation into that missing $2.3 trillion was done in the Office of Naval Investigation, which is kind of inside an inside ring. And also the Army auditors apparently were also looking into that. Both of those offices were not close together and seriously damaged, and not necessarily in the where they claim that airplane was as well. So according to my eyewitness who was there, he guaranteed me there was no 757 there. And from what I understand from Barbara Honegger, there were set explosives in certain offices that needed to be they needed to have some people taken out, and they needed to have that investigation stopped, which they did. And that there were multiple explosions being heard going off by eyewitnesses that were there. Now,
which kind of makes a little bit of sense considering what was actually housed in Building 7 also.
Exactly. And true. And also, just so you know, that my publisher actually received a phone call from someone that was ordering a box of books by bulk, because you can buy the books in a box of like 24 and get them for almost half price. So a lot of airline pilots from American and United are doing just that. They're buying 48 and 24 books at a time directly from the publisher. But this particular gentleman was on vacation, and he met a guy and his wife. His wife was working in the Pentagon that morning. She doesn't know who made the phone call, but she received a phone call. She said it was about an hour before anything hit in New York. And the voice on the phone said, "Get the heck out of the Pentagon and get out now," and hung up. And she doesn't know who it was, but she did grab her purse and get out of there. And that's why she is alive today. So people knew this was an hour before anything hit downtown New York. So people knew a lot of stuff that was coming down.
Yeah, and okay, and I know we didn't focus heavily on the book. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But
that's okay.
What? A lot of this stuff, though, is actually contained within, and of course, you've continued on. But let's kind of give people a brief sort of idea, because you started out with, with your journey, why it was that you needed to look into this, exactly what your background is. You've absolutely shown why that's relevant and why this is interesting throughout the book. Of course, your husband's another character in the book,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll talk about him another time maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but the thing is, going through this journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not only do you wind up, investigating this stuff by the firsthand evidence, but you wind up talking to people who are involved in the truth movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the character that represents you, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
winds
Mm-hmm.
up talking to people in the truth movement and stuff like that. I wonder if you want to give people like an idea about that.
Yeah, what I did is, like I said, I wrote this book for not the person who thinks they already know everything because they studied this for a decade. Because I have physicists and aeronautical engineers and airline pilots that are calling me and saying, someone finally figured it out. This is exactly how it was done, how it was covered up by PTEC and Mitra, or Mitre Company, and exactly what happened, and more than likely what probably happened, how they told the crew they were part of a drill. They removed two people off of each aircraft until they got to Flight 93. Then they created the Let's Row scenario. And if you'll notice that books by the survivors of the women, of the wives that were related to the passengers on Flight 93, all got big book deals from big publishing companies in New York, and even made a Hollywood movie out of Flight 93 to cram it into your head as if they hadn't done a good enough job in the media to brainwash you into what your reality is. And that is the illusion. They
Sure.
needed these phone calls to be made to paint the illusion so you would know who to point your gun at, who to hate, what religious group you should be hating. And it was all a manipulation, an illusion. And so what I found and what I did, I wrote the book so that I could help wake people up, because let me just talk about that future plan so I don't forget it, because then I know some people are going to want to make some phone calls into you.
I was just going to say, with the last 30 minutes or so, I
Yes.
definitely want to make sure that we get into that, because all of this stuff led you to some interesting conclusions and led you to understand that that the Great Boogeyman had been created,
Mm-hmm.
that this was obviously a huge shell game once again. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
if you look back at the '93 bombing, you can find control of federal agents
Exactly.
by people
Mm-hmm.
that were allegedly the bombing plotters and all that, right on down to a recording that you can get your hands on if you try hard enough, of them explaining, no, use the real bomb stuff, don't use the fake stuff, so on and so forth. Let's have fun with that, of course, but okay, we'll put it all aside. And now we look at
Exactly.
what's coming, because to me, I'm watching this ISIS thing happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm watching the continuation. I mean, it's yet again another Al Qaeda, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have
Mm-hmm.
another, somebody that we supported, somebody that we backed, somebody that we actually had control of at one point, supposedly flipping on us and becoming our greatest enemy and becoming part of this fictitious war on terror nonsense once again. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But meanwhile, there's still a huge danger.
Oh, yes, yes. And listen, we're waking up so rapidly, and what's happening, you'll see, is people like yourself in the alternative media, on the internet, and that's why they want control of this internet so badly. We are helping people wake up so rapidly, and basically, I tell people the skunk or the rat or the vermin is cornered in a corner, and he is about to strike out at us. And I believe that I found what their next plan is, and I wrote it into the book, because this is the most important thing, and I need to get this out every day, and I want people to talk about it. The plan, and this is what happened to me. Luckily, I was reading, I got a brand new iPad. This was a couple years ago. And I was reading news sites to my husband as we were in a car ride, and I found an article that headline captured me, and it said the Israeli intelligence had intercepted Al Qaeda plans to strike America. Something paraphrasing. I read this because it had been scrubbed off the internet, but I did remember these details and what it claimed, because I had just read the news and it wasn't in any of our news in America. But I think it was called Ynet News or some company like that. It was an Israeli news article written in English, and it said that Israeli intelligence had intercepted plans by Al Qaeda to commemorate the fake Navy SEAL death of Osama bin Laden. We know he really died in December of 2001, but we're in the alternate universe. We're led to believe that the SEAL Team 6 killed him, and then we killed the SEAL Team 6 in May 2nd, 2011. And so it was to commemorate the death of Osama bin Laden by SEAL Team. May 2nd, it would begin, and it would strike 5 or 6 major cities across the country and kind of hitting in every quadrant, so to speak, and that it would be a combination of biological weapons, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons. And that it would go on for 9 days until May 11th. And that 9/11 popped out at me. I was like, what? It was like a flag waving in my face, hitting me over the head like a stick. And I read this to my husband. I said, I went immediately and I looked in every news agency. There was nothing about this in any American news agency. And this is about 5 or 6 major U.S. cities that they intercepted. And I remembered immediately what I had found, that the Israeli intelligence claimed after 9/11. Well, we tried to tell the U.S. government. We tried to tell them we were on the track of these terrorists. They wouldn't listen to us. They kind of tried to point themselves out to be a hero. So I think that might be our next false flag.
And they hear us a little bit behind. So I'm going to tell you guys now, if you want to call in, 718-717-8296. If you're on my Skype list, I'll add you in as well. Just straight out, we don't screen. We don't bother to check to see what it is you're going to ask. And I happen to know that Rebekah is prepared for just about any question you could possibly throw at her. So by all means, if you want to join into the discussion, ask something or make a comment, go right ahead. I'm waiting for one of you guys because I warned her, by the way, before air, and she can attest to this. I already warned her before air that somebody was going to call up and ask her about the dancing Israelis. So don't disappoint me, guys. Go ahead, call in. Ask that question, because you do it all the time. I know you do, and I know you guys are happy with me in the chat room, which, by the way, is a rarity. They usually get kind of upset with me because I don't know why exactly. I guess I hold back on certain things, but I mean, have you felt as though I've tried to restrict the conversation in any way, shape, or form?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. All I've tried to do really is ask a couple of pertinent questions here and there and sort of interrupt and, kind of guide it through, which is kind of my job as the host. But other than that, I don't think I've said, oh, no, don't talk about that.
Yeah, no. Well, said that guy doesn't want to call and ask about it. We can talk about it because that is kind of fascinating. It's one of the things I found. I found there were some 250 what they called Israeli art students, basically all they were all Mossad agents all over the country, and they were selling art to American government businesses or government offices everywhere. And they were going in there, and it was the Department of Energy and all over to these government offices trying to sell this artwork that they had. There were also some artists that were renting in the World Trade Center. I don't even know who they were paying their rent to, or if they were actually paying to rent them, but they kind of had the run of those towers as well. And they were kind of, interestingly enough, all of these Israelis were gathered up shortly after 9/11, and they were flown out of the country, thanks to Michael Chertoff. But yes, in New Jersey, there was a woman who could see the towers from her place, and she saw down in the parking lot these 3 or 5 guys that were taking pictures and doing things with their cigarette lighter, jumping up and down, really having a super celebration watching this event take place, and the black smoke coming out of the towers, et cetera, et cetera. Those 5 dancing Israelis, the Fox News people tried to tell you they were Palestinians because when they got picked up, they actually said, "We're not your problem. The Palestinians are your problem."
Right. But, caller 914 area code, you're on the air.
Hi, my name is Rudy Dent, and I'd just like to say this is brilliant, fascinating, and inspiring. I know Rebekah, and she is just incredible. I am particularly, am I on, or?
You're live right away. Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, okay. I still hear her talking on the other
There's a
on the headphones.
delay. Yeah, there's a delay when you're listening to the broadcast. So if you shut that off, you'll just hear us talking to you on the phone. Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's okay. One thing in particular, I've been studying this as well, and Rebekah and I have spoken before. She is incredible. Now, what she brought up about the next false flag confirms what my suspicions had been, and that is that the next false flag has to be even bigger than 9/11. Yes, than 9/11. Otherwise, it won't have the desired effect. And I have gotten bits and pieces of information to confirm that. But not only that, but that nukes will also be used in that. And, I so hope we're wrong. I so hope that just getting it out there might divert it. And I do know that they are behind schedule with their false flags, because some have already been thwarted, by exposure.
Right. Rudy, let me ask you a question, because I was extremely disturbed last year when Obama was at the 9/11 memorial spot where they brought in those 3 bags of alleged remains of victims. You know what I'm talking about?
Not in particular, but go.
Okay, well, he was making a statement there that, all of a sudden in the midst of this discussion about dedicating the memorial and how it was going to open and people were going to be able to come there and this and that and the third thing, he throws in a reference to the possibility of a dirty bomb being detonated in New York City. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
No, but
I do too.
It stands to reason he's preparing us. Go ahead, Rebekah.
Let me tell you this. Last Friday, I had done a Costco run, and I only turned my television on to see how they're trying to program the masses, and it was on Fox News. I guess maybe my husband had watched something on there. I just hit the turn on button, and it was on this channel. And so I was just listening while I'm putting away all these groceries and stuff. And there was a guy, and I think he was from one of the Carolinas. And what caught my attention, I didn't grab his name because I didn't really pay much attention until he started to say that he is preparing the people of his state for a biological, chemical, and or nuclear strike. And that's right out of my book. That's exactly what I found in that Israeli newspaper, claiming that Al-Qaeda was going to do this to us. And I was like, wow, has he read The Methodical Illusion? I was like, what? And I never caught his name, but I just believe he was from one of the Carolinas. He was talking to Brett Barr, one of those guys. And he's just started talking about how important it was that and I always tell people this too, you better be prepared, because you want to be as prepared as you can be for any one or all of those, especially if you're anywhere near a major city, anywhere in the country, I mean, any major city. When he read that out, I was like, that is the plan that I read about in that Ynet News, that Israeli newspaper that has been scrubbed from the internet, by the way.
Yeah,
I do know that, I've gotten through to me that there is a need or a standard practice of telling us what they're going to do before they do it. And I believe the logic is that if we're stupid enough not to take heed, then we deserve what we get. And also, it relieves them of bad karma.
Well, maybe that's true. But, that's exactly, Rudy, where I went back to when I kept going back to how did they kill these people so quickly on the planes, because they only had 15 minutes to get rid of nearly 100 people on Flight 11. And then it dawned on me the mace or pepper spray was what they were telling us was that message. And that message came through on almost all the flights. And so that was the Illuminati message, where they're using something along that line. Well, of course, you're not going to die from mace or pepper spray, but you certainly die really quickly from the hydrogen cyanide gas. And I did look that up, and it does go quickly, and it was probably a lot faster than and less stressful than being flown into a building.
In a pre-built gas chamber. Environment.
Exactly, because even if, I was telling you, I was trying to go through this scenario as a flight attendant, even if somebody sprayed that in there, it would take you a while to know what it was. You wouldn't expect anything like this as a flight attendant. You wouldn't know to arm your door and open the door and get people out. You wouldn't be able to react quick enough. By the time 30 seconds was up, that the air would be filled with that gas, and they may have managed to open a door, and they may have managed to blow a chute or something, but those people would be dead on the tarmac because that stuff absolutely is quick.
Right.
Yeah.
So
and if they grabbed the drop down mask, they wouldn't help either, right?
No, they wouldn't, because those have to be activated. And here's another thing about using pepper spray or mace in a hijack situation. The hijackers themselves would have gassed themselves. And so they would have incapacitated themselves, whether they were at the helm of the aircraft or not. They would have got the pilots, if they were flying the aircraft or not, the flight attendants and the passengers. Everyone would have been affected by that. And if you were to hijack an airplane, the last thing you would do is gas yourself with pepper spray or mace. It just doesn't make any sense.
That's kind of what I was trying to say before about that. It's completely counterintuitive because it goes everywhere. You can't control it. It's not like you're going to avoid it. And even if you try and put something over your mouth or whatever, it's still going to get in your eyes. It irritates. There's no way. There's no way in an enclosed space. You know how
incapacitated the hijackers would have made themselves, even if they were in the cockpit, because at that time the cockpit door was just you could see daylight through it. It wasn't anywhere airtight or anything like that. I mean, they would have, especially if they would have sprayed that stuff right up there, it would have got the pilots too.
Right. Rudy, I want to thank you for calling.
Okay, I just have one more question. Rebekah, sure. You've raised a really serious issue about the impending false flag, which I believe is really coming. Mm-hmm. And what is it that we can realistically do to try to prevent this from happening, other than, what we're doing, what I'm trying, to wake up as many people as possible.
The best thing to do is use what we have. We have social media and we have these radio shows, and just talk about it and get it out there so that people understand that this has actually been planned. I saw it 2 years ago. And so it has been out there, and it is a plan. This is a Jubilee year. It's the Shemitah. It's that 7-year cycle. If it doesn't happen May 2nd this year, watch out for September 11th. And those would be, actually someone contacted me that was an astrologer who forecasted 9/11 before it happened. So I'm like, okay, tell me what you see in May, and I'll let you guys know. Trust me. I'll let everybody know if I hear something like that. If it's in the stars and the planets, like it was prior to 9/11, like this guy claimed, then maybe we'll have an idea. But talk, and tell people what's out there. That is the best way to do it. And that's one way I try to talk about this. I put it in the book, and it is not fake. It's part of the novel. And in the novel, just so your listeners know, I did have to create the cities. They didn't tell us the details of which 6 cities. I just had to use my own creative juices there and pick them myself. And just so you know, also, Chuck, that Rudy Dent is one of the New York firefighters that spent about a month on the pile after 9/11. And this last year, I had written this book 2 years ago, and this last year I had a long conversation with him. And when I found out what he went through and losing the 343 coworkers, and I have actually come from a long line of firefighters in my family, throughout my family. And I was so inspired to brush this book up and edit it as best as I could and get it into print that it was a driving force. And 6 weeks later, it hit Amazon. And I owe this to Rudy. And now it is last I looked, about 21 over all 8 million books on Amazon, and number 17 in Barnes & Noble. And sometime today, both of them tried to say that it was no longer in print. But it is, so just keep ordering it. Because they're not happy about this.
Rudy, just so
Thank you both.
Just so you know, Rudy, just so you know, I was one of those guys sending crates of water over from New Jersey at the time you were over there digging. Okay.
Okay. It was interesting. The day after the event, it looked like a Western city, like something in the old Western town, with all the tents and all the patriotic donations from various businesses, to help us with the search.
Right.
It was incredible. Patriotism is alive in America. It just has to be directed properly toward the right direction. Our core values, respecting our founding fathers and what they actually stood for, I think we've forgotten who we are. And we've lost our direction, and we need to get back on track.
That's
Amen.
very true. And,
All right.
and I think we need to exterminate some of the rats that have really destroyed our culture, and a lot through the Hollywood and television, and brought in things that just have destroyed us.
Absolutely. Rudy, thank you, A, for your service, and B, for calling in. I really appreciate you. And if you ever want to get in touch with me, find me, because I would love to tell the story about exactly what went down in the days and weeks after 9/11, which I don't think has been accurately told on a radio show of my kind. So if you want to get in touch with me, just look for me on Facebook or wherever else. Or
I'll connect you, Rudy.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right. Do that.
Thank you,
Anyway,
guys.
Rudy, thank you.
Great show.
Thank you.
Have a good night, Rudy.
Okay. Bye-bye.
And we also have Cy Girl on the line, which I know this is going to be interesting. Cy Girl is always a fascinating caller to the show and to other shows, because I do hear you on other shows every once in a while when I scan through some stuff, Cy Girl. Always amazing and interesting. Wondering what you have to add to the conversation.
Well, it's always good to listen to you, Charles. You do a great interview. I haven't read the book yet. I don't generally read fiction much. You know, Steve Alton a few years back did the Shell Game, which was another 9/11 related fictional novel that I suppose delved more into the agendas that might be behind it. But I don't generally read fiction much because although I suppose if someone's going to put the details into the fiction, you have to read the fiction to understand it. I would say my greatest concern is the tendency of many people, is a kind of escapist tendency that many people will have or have had all along, to sort of get lost in the operational details of, who did this and who moved that piece around and, who was, and of course, if you were indeed preparing a criminal case, that's what you do. You'd want to put a face and a name behind it, for sure. My concern is that kind of lost in this is I guess I haven't heard the word psyop or the phrase psychological operation. Well, maybe Rebekah did use the word psychological at one point or another in this, but I want to come back to it because I feel that's the heart of 9/11. Whatever cartoonish stuff they may have broadcast and whatever cheap, frankly, Hollywood B-grade scripts, which was obvious to me from the moment it happened, and I said so loudly and openly and paid for it. Because I didn't buy the Pentagon hit for 1 second. I expected heads to roll at NORAD, and then when I tuned into C-SPAN that evening and watched Carl Levin and John Warner, I couldn't believe it, literally congratulate General Richard Myers, who was the acting head of the JCS. Hugh Shelton was sort of in the process of retiring, and they also had Major General Larry Arnold, who I guess command a U.S. Air Force. They had all these figures, and I thought, oh my God, they're actually going to bring them out in the open. These guys are going to be court-martialed, just like, say, Admiral Kimmel or Major General Short at Pearl Harbor. Because it's absolutely unthinkable that now we're not talking about a Soviet MiG or a missile here. We're talking about a big, fat Boeing commercial jet, not a DU hardened missile, a Boeing commercial jet that maybe can reach 500 miles per hour. I guess those are the details that your author is more expert at, or any of you pilots out there. But one way or another, living where I live, less than an hour from Andrews Air Force Base, on a day when the president was flying in and out down there to Sarasota to read pet goat stories to little kids. That was part of the narrative as well, I think. As you have so correctly, this is a narrative that they spun, basically, a script. whatever the operational details on the ground, and however many people they had to silence, and however many deaths they faked, however many identities they faked in this, whether of passengers or
alleged
frankly,
hijackers, the
right.
whole thing.
I have to say, I don't think they faked the identities of. There's at least one pilot I know of, Oganowski, and I don't think they faked him at all. I think they got him stowed somewhere, and there may be others as well, and that's largely as a consequence of some of the research of a local who lives up there and near his family, who I know who's researched this. But I guess what I want to get back to is this idea of the media psyop, Here's what will happen.
Well, we opened up the show. I don't know if you caught the very beginning, but we opened up the show with discussing what I always refer to as the trauma-based programming, the foundation of that continuous play loop that day, and what went on for the next easily 10 days straight without any sort of break. That went on in the media, the continuous showing of the images, then the introduction of these individuals, the lists, the names. This stuff was, the largest attack ever, in every newspaper, every single conduit that was available to the mainstream was absolutely saturated with traumatizing the public. So, I mean, that's part of it, but there's a whole lot more to it. I mean, I'm sure Rebekah has something to say about that. So.
Well, that's very true. And, the thing that I found really bizarre, and I talked to Rudy about this too, because on any given day, if you were to go down to your local hardware store, or your Walmart, or some sort of variety type of store, you'll find maybe a half a dozen flags. But you will remember that flags came out of everywhere. And Rudy was telling me there was guys down there handing out little flags that were specially designed for the firefighters' helmets. They clipped onto their helmet, and there were thousands of them everywhere. And when I went back to the airline, we had stickers. Now, regulations wouldn't have allowed us to put a sticker for something else on our luggage, but after that, we could have an American flag sticker, and they were everywhere. They were stuck on everything. Remember the huge, gigantic flags on the buildings down in New York? They were like 15 by 20 feet, huge, gigantic flags. These are custom-made flags. They don't just pop up, and they kind of came up overnight, which I thought that was very odd at the very beginning.
Yeah, within 72 hours, because I worked for a retail outlet and I was in a management position. This is why I was able to get my hands on large quantities of water that I said I had sent to Rudy and the people digging. But the fact is that within 72 hours, every single retailer, especially because I was in New Jersey, especially in New Jersey, was flooded with the flags that go on your car, the flag pins, the flag stickers. We were all flooded with it. And I mean, everything from a 7-Eleven to a grocery store had a section of American flags.
I often say it was like the Super Bowl psyop of the century. We picked our team, red, white, and blue. That's our flag. Just like if you see the games in the Super Bowl, you're with the Eagles, or you're with the Bulls or the Seahawks, or like a team. It was like picking your team.
It's much what I like in the entire political system too at this point. Pick a red shirt or a blue shirt, and then decide who's good and evil based on that.
Exactly. And that's why they unfurled those flags. And don't forget our president at the big bullhorn and his speech. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
Oh, and he had a message for those people over there who did this.
And don't forget, he also said, and don't be misled by wild conspiracies. I thought that was really weird. I thought, well, this looks like an act of war. Well, who would be talking about wild conspiracies? Because, I mean, I just didn't question. I was watching it and being brainwashed just like everyone else. And it wasn't until I wrote this book and discovered all this stuff that I actually woke up. And so the whole idea of the methodical illusion was basically to help those people that still, it's very uncomfortable to come out of there. I felt like I'd been kicked in the gut. I was sick to my stomach for a month. I couldn't write. I was paralyzed to really realize the depth of the deception and the evil and the psychological warfare used on us and still are. If you will turn on your TV, and it can be CNN or Fox, one of the news channels, and just listen for a couple hours, every time they talk about ISIS, they talk about 9/11 in that, within a sentence of talking about that. You don't have to listen to 3 sentences and they'll go, like on 9/11. They just are constantly bringing that up. They are programming you for this next event. It is planned and it will happen. So be ready.
Yeah, even when Cousin Barry is standing at a bridge trying to commemorate an event and all that other good stuff, which is a whole nebulous problem also. But even when he's discussing that, of course, 9/11 has to come into play. 9/11 comes into play anytime they're attempting to evoke emotion among the adult population, which is relatively mature. Now, the millennial generation is not so attached to it. And it almost seems logical, and I hate to say this because this is going to sound really messed up, and I know we only got 5 minutes left, but, you know, it seems like it's just about time to spank the millennials, to put them in fear, because they don't have a clear memory of 9/11. They were toddlers, or they weren't born yet, or
That's
whatever
right.
else. So it does seem as though we are now approaching the time when another one of these trauma-based events is going to be required for the replay cycles. I mean, I don't know, Cy Girl, what do you think about that?
We need to face the fact that the psychological operation had already been well completed before the event itself, in terms of the population being prepared for this and demonstrating that it was prepared for this. And I don't need to go back as far as the Kennedy assassination for that. I can look at something as relatively recent as the Waco massacre.
That's my job, sorry.
Right. What happened, or the 93 bombing staged by the FBI. We had more than enough evidence of FBI involvement in that to see what was happening, but people just rolled over for it. Then, of course, we had the Oklahoma City bombing, and I looked at that and thought, oh my God, there's no way a truck full of fertilizer did this. It blew away the front half of the building.
It gutted half of the building.
And you had generals like, Brenton Parton, publishing papers on this, and I thought, oh my God, are you guys going to let your FBI get away with this? So to me, when 9/11 happened, it was almost like confirmation of something that I had been afraid of all along. And to know, and we have to consider this now, in terms of the population we're dealing with now, to understand that on the morning after, on the day after, on the week after, and remember, we could spend a whole hour on the anthrax, the staged anthrax psyop.
Oh yeah, we forgot that. Yeah.
Right, which, by the way, they officially designate as an inside job, except they picked some patsy and then suicided him. Poor Bruce Ivans. Or maybe I shouldn't say poor Bruce Ivans, because he was a biological weapons scientist working up there at Fort Detrick. So,
do you know, let me tell you something I found out. Remember the guy Stephen Hatfield that they first claimed was the anthrax guy? Stephen Hatfield?
He sued and won.
Guess what? He sat on the board of directors for SAIC along with John Deutsch and a whole bunch of other people that planned this entire event, people that ran the security at the towers. He was on the board of directors at the time of 9/11. The whole lawsuit was his payoff, his reward for just walking the walk. That whole thing was a sham. He was on the board of directors at SAIC. He was one of them.
Something as mobbed up as this, we shouldn't have any illusions that we're going to take down any of the, like you referenced Dov Zakheim earlier. Of course, Rumsfeld's still running around out there. I don't know. Who knows? He might be senile by, a lot of these guys will probably die off, but they're still, they're running things. It's mobbed up and they're running things. So if we're talking about taking them down, let's be honest about this. Thousands of uniformed personnel at Andrews Air Force Base knew that the official account of the Pentagon hit had to be bogus from the moment the narrative was spun out. They had to know that. If I knew it, they knew it.
Right.
But they rolled over. And the thing is, this is what you have in a mobbed up gangster situation. Now, these guys in uniform, if we go after the people in uniform, we'll be accused of being unpatriotic. If we go after the politicians, how they can hide. They got their lawyered up. Or, it's very, I say our softest target, because it's mainly it's because the heart of it is mind control and psychological operations. our best.
Girl, we're just about to run out of time. I want to direct everybody to go to methodicalillusion.com, and I want to thank everybody that tuned into the Ochelli Effect at ucy.tv/TOE. Go to methodicalillusion.com. You can get an autograph book there if you want to, although Rebekah's kind of being inundated with requests. I'm sure she'll get to it. And,
I will. And
know,
it's also, you can order it on Amazon. It's in Kindle form. You can get it right away. It's $9.11 on Kindle.
There you go, $9.11. So interesting. And Girl, I'm sorry to have cut you off, but I know that really loud new bumper is going to cut me off in just a few seconds, and we're going to be on to the next show. So I want to thank you for calling in. And Girl, I wish you'd called in earlier, but thank you. And I want to